Починаємо сьогодні нашу другу лекцію з лекторією щодо психологічної допомоги пацієнтам з ПТСР. Поки ми очікуємо на нашу лекторку, я оголошу про наші загалом технічні питання. Наша лекція ведеться англійською мовою, однак всі учасники в Zoom, хто є зареєстрований на Zoom-трансляцію, можуть переключити собі у нижній панелі Zoom синхронний переклад на українську мову. Ми дуже дякуємо проекту Mental Health for You за співпрацю і за те, що маємо можливість синхронного перекладу. Також дуже дякуємо проекту Нейротвін за організацію цього лекторію. Питання ви можете поставити у чаті під час лекції, і відповідно в кінці лекції моя колега Юлія Гриценко озвучить ці всі питання, і ви матимете нагоду почути відповіді на них. Я нагадаю, що наша трансляція буде англійською мовою, однак переклад українською мовою буде найближчим часом доступний також на нашому YouTube-каналі. Тому, звичайно, ви зможете отримати доступ до всіх наших лекцій. Бачу, що з цього приводу навіть є питання. Звичайно, що переклад українською мовою ми також розмістимо для доступу всім охочим, і запрошую вас також ділитися інформацією про лекцію, інформацією про тренінг. Зараз ми вирішимо декілька технічних питань щодо підключення лектора, тому прошу ще кілька хвилин зачекати, поки ми налагодимо зв'язок.
Good evening, can you hear me now? Good evening.
Good evening, yes, we are hear you. Захава, are you with us? Please turn on your microphone.
Now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Would you be so kind as to put on my presentation? Because I was waiting for you about half an hour and nobody did that. So if you be so kind to do it now. Does everybody see my presentation?
Захава, good evening. We
Good
hear you
evening.
well.
No.
Oh, hello.
Hello,
Захава.
hello. Can you upload my presentation?
Do you want me to open, you send me or you want to?
Yeah, I send you the presentation. Yes, please, if you could upload it.
Mhm.
Okay.
Just a moment. Just a moment.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Юля, ти може зааплодиш?
Давайте я її відкрию.
I can speak without it, but I can hear you now.
We are uploading your presentation.
Wonderful. I'll start and then you know we can.
Yeah,
go.
let me say a few words about you.
Sure.
So I will introduce you in Ukrainian, and our translators will translate it in English. And your lectures will also be translated. It will be synchronous translation. So you just talk in your regular temp.
Thank you.
Ну що ж, дорогі колеги, вітаю вас від імені Академії Добробут. І я хочу презентувати вам сьогоднішнього нашого спікера, професора Захаву Соломон. Вона є почесним професором школи соціальної роботи в Тель-Авівському університеті. Вона також обіймала посаду керівника відділу досліджень психологічного здоров'я в силах оборони Ізраїлю. Вона підполковник медичної служби у відставці. Вона була удостоєна багатьох нагород, а найзвичайнішою є Премія Ізраїлю, яка є найвищою відзнакою для вченого в Ізраїлі.
There is no need to translate it because of time constraints. I'm fine with it.
Sorry?
If you want to save time, you don't have to translate what you said about me.
Okay. I think that our listeners understood me, and I said that you are one of the greatest psychologists in Israel, and you've got Israel Award.
Thank
for
you.
your achievements, and we are very proud to have you as a lecturer today.
Thank you.
So we are still waiting for the presentation. So,
oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Can I?
Yeah, the floor is yours. Please start.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody. I'm honored and delighted, and I know that you are going through very difficult times, and my heart goes out to you. Israel has had so many wars and terrorist attacks that I know what you guys are experiencing, and I feel very, very sorry. In my humble way, I'll try to share with you some of the lessons that we have learned over the years with regard to PTSD and the various consequences, psychiatric and psychological consequences on war. And I'll focus tonight on soldiers. And unfortunately, I believe that many of the lessons that we have learned will be of value to you in your own country. Can I have the next slide, please? I will be talking today. I can't move it because you did not have a shared screen, or no. Can anybody switch the slides, or do you want me to do it? Nana, please let me know. No, we're having a lot of issues here with the slides. Can you help me with the slides? Please?
Yes, one moment, please.
Okay. The topics that I will be covering tonight have to do with PTSD trajectories and its correlates, the interplay of coping and symptoms, when symptoms become entrenched, and I'll answer the question, is recovery complete? And then briefly we'll touch on factors that are implicated in recovery. The first issue that I would like to address is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. As you all know, this is the only psychiatric problem that is believed to be triggered by an event. The next one, please. And therefore, it is people who suffer from PTSD are liable to both treatment and consequences. And the disease or the impairment itself is quite profound and also has many ramifications, as will be explained shortly. Do you want to translate now? Or do you want me to go on? Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. When you look at the time sequence, you can see that the traumatic events lead in most people to an acute stress reaction. This is not a disorder, but in the first 48 hours, many people suffer from the dire consequences of the trauma. And only later, up to 4 weeks, we describe it as acute stress disorder. Only later on, after a month or so, it's called acute PTSD. And 12 weeks later, it becomes chronic PTSD. So this is very important in terms of treatment and also in terms of classification. Now it's very far from you, but in several years' time, the issue of compensation will become also quite important. The next slide, please. Okay, the question is everybody who is exposed to traumatic stress traumatized? And obviously, from the horrific scenes that we see in Ukraine now, the question is very pertinent. We know that the majority of people will suffer from acute stress reaction, but in the general population, while the majority of people will meet criteria A, that is the exposure, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD is much smaller. It is considered to be 5 for men and 10.4 for women. Women are always seen as more vulnerable than men in terms of PTSD. The next slide, please. The question then becomes, what is the course of events? So you can see that at the onset, the majority of people respond with symptoms that are in line with acute stress reaction. Here you see 94%, but then in time, with time, it declines. So we are talking about a situation where at the onset, the majority of people have symptoms, but with time, many of them actually subside. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so it is commonly accepted that the PTSD symptoms are intense and prevalent in the immediate aftermath. That is the time that you are experiencing now, but with time it will change and it will decline. Can we have the next slide, please? Another one down. Okay, can we go down, please? Okay, another one. So the good news is that with time, many of the people that you see now that seem to be shook up by their experience, often they will they will suffer from less symptoms. And we've seen that around the world in 9/11, in the US, among rape victims, in Israeli terror survivors, and also among Israeli motor vehicle survivors. Next one, please. So what we conceive as PTSD, the symptoms are initially functional. That is, people have difficulties, they're hypervigilant, they dissociate over time. But when used to access an outline of traumatic events, in the long run, for most people, it will become part of their life. So in fact, the next slide, please. So in fact, what we see is that PTSD is a disorder of failure to recover. And this is very important in terms of the importance of immediate or primary prevention, because with time, many of the symptoms will subside anyway. Can we have the next slide, please? Let me just say that there are numerous biological and psychological explanations for the failure to bounce back. And here what we can see is that one can get stuck on PTSD by believing that if people believed before the war that the world is just and people should be trusted and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, the war actually shows us that innocent people are killed, innocent people are wounded. And in fact, what we see is that our whole belief system about the world has changed. And oftentimes this change is related to the fact that we get stuck on PTSD. Can we have the next slide, please? And overall, there are these beliefs and assumptions about the self and the world change so much after the traumatic events that they no longer are accurate. People who have seen the brutal acts of war find it very, very difficult to believe in a just world. So the roads to recovery become blocked because people like the little girl who've seen horrific things can no longer feel safe. The mother who have had to abandon her mother in the ruins in Mariupol or other places cannot relax. She feels emotionally isolated. She's unable to have an optimistic zone for recovery. And the trauma now changes her beliefs about the world. What we see is that the long-term cause of PTSD is reflected in many of our studies, and I would like to share some of our understanding and insights with you. Can we have the next slide, please? The next slide, please. And yeah, another one. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned in Israel. The next slide, please. Okay, and the question was, Does the war end when the shooting stops? And obviously, this is what you are concerned with. What would happen? Well, you have to deal with the people now. But once there is some sort of an agreement, a ceasefire, what will happen to you, to the loved ones, and to everybody else in the Ukraine? Can we have the next slide, please? What I did, I studied for 40 years, 2 groups of people. One of them, all the soldiers who had a psychological breakdown on the battlefield in the Lebanon War in 1982, and we had a match control. And then we assessed the psychiatric, the somatic, the functional sequelae over a course of 40 years. And we also studied the spouses, the wives of these men. The next slide, please. The second study is of 4 groups of individuals who fought in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Again, we studied them for 40 years. Here we have both spouses and children, that is adult children. The next slide, please. We started out, the next slide, please. We started out with all the soldiers who had combat stress reaction. This is a labile polymorphic phenomena marked by a wide variety of somatic and affective manifestation. The soldiers can look very restless and dissociative and withdrawn. And then in the morning and then in the evening, they become completely wild. They run amok and all kinds of things. So what we do is we diagnose combat stress reaction on the basis of functional impairment, not symptoms, but functional impairment. That is, the various manifestations all come down to a common denominator, that these soldiers can no longer function. I don't know to what extent you have in the Ukrainian army mental health officers as we have in Israel, but what will become clear after my presentation, that once the war ends, the shooting does not stop. Can we see the next slide, please? Next slide, please. We asked ourselves, is it a transient reaction? Will it pass after the war ends? Do the veterans recover once they're back at home? And the answer is in the next slide. This is a pretty shocking slide because it shows you that despite the fact that we have given these combat stress reaction soldiers every possible treatment, and the treatment that we gave them was in fact effective for 20 years because we assessed its utility and effectiveness 20 years down the line. Nevertheless, the majority of the combat stress reaction casualties continue to suffer from very high rates of PTSD. 59% of all casualties suffer from PTSD 1 year after the war. 2 years down the road, 56%, 3 years, 43%, and 20 years after the war ended, 38% of all combat stress reaction casualties still suffer from PTSD. Given that I don't know if you have diagnosis on the battlefield, I assume you don't. Look at the blue bars. These are the control veterans. These men did not have a psychological breakdown on the battlefield, but they represent very large groups. So in fact, 16, 19, 9, and 13% respectively of these men suffer from PTSD rates. That is, if you look at if you extrapolate from these symptoms, from this bar, you can see that a lot more people suffer from PTSD, but were not diagnosed and were not treated. This is a very important finding in terms of diagnosis and treatment, because you should expect and probably will see very high numbers of individuals who never ask for help, never ask for psychological treatment. This is particularly true among men who want to behave as, in Israel, we have the macho culture, and it's not easy to disclose weakness. So this is a very important point in terms of following up and suggesting and offering help to traumatized war veterans, that is soldiers. The next slide, please. What we know is, can we have the next slide, please? What we know is that PTSD and responses to traumatic events are not stable. They change over time, but we have several trajectories. That is the course of PTSD. We have chronic PTSD, where people suffer from PTSD symptoms uninterruptedly. We have delayed onset, which is a very, very important. Can we go back to the original slide? The other one is delayed onset. Next, because another one, please. Another one. Go on. On. No, yeah. Okay. Oh, another one. Yeah. Now you can see this is okay. You can see that there is chronic, there is recovery, there is resilience. The people who do not have any PTSD symptoms, their defenses are very, very strong, and they're lucky enough not to suffer. But we have delayed and reactivated PTSD that might be of interest and importance to you. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, this very busy slide was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, although I always tell my students not to use busy slides. But what you can see is that you can have PTSD at one point in time, but not in the next year, because the symptoms fluctuate. It's not a disease that is steady. It changes. Sometimes you meet criteria and sometimes you don't. And this has very important ramification, not only for treatment, but for compensation and later on for recognition. The next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, you can see here that among the soldiers who had combat stress reaction, that is, they had a psychological breakdown on the battlefield, the majority suffered from PTSD 1, 2, or 3 times in the course of time, or even 4, whereas in the non-CSR group, the majority did not suffer from PTSD at any point in time, but still many of them are quite vulnerable. Next slide, please. You can see the odd ratios and understand the differences. What is very important in the type of reactivated PTSD. Reactivated PTSD is a PTSD that comes up after an asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic period where the individual is reminded of the original trauma. And what we see is that even very remote reminders, loud noises, and sometimes, you know, the humidity or the heat of the day, if the trauma occurred on a certain weather. Now in the Ukraine, you still have winter. So you might expect the winters to be emotionally charged for the veterans and for individuals in general, because there are lots of other, it's like the Pavlovian conditioning. A lot of the things that are related to the time of the trauma will be experienced as a reactivation, that is the arousal of PTSD again. And obviously, those who have more sensitivity, their PTSD will be easily reactivated. At this point in time, the next slide, please. This point in time, I would like to draw your attention. If you're interested in any of the things that I'm talking about, you can read about them because I've published more than 450 articles in the professional journals, and also several books, 7 books to be exact. So if you want to go deeper into any of the issues, you can find a lot of the material there. Delayed onset, this is a very controversial issue. And I expect that in the Ukraine, in years to come, it will become a heated debate, because sometimes you see an individual who coped with stress well, and only later on, sometimes years later, there is an onset of PTSD. And you ask yourself, what is it? Is this person out for compensation? What happened to him? And sometimes the event that actually activates the PTSD could be a happy event. We've seen a case where an individual, his daughter married, so this is the happy occasion. But the marriage led him to feel that he was sort of losing the daughter, and this was strong enough and a trigger for delayed onset PTSD. The good news is that delayed onset is less severe than chronic PTSD. The bad news is that it's like bombs that can explode even years after the trauma. Next slide, please. So please beware of delayed onset PTSD. It's very important to realize that there is such an option. And obviously with time, you see more and more delayed onset. Next slide, please. This article was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. So now we wondered whether delayed onset is more severe than other PTSD trajectories, because you know that with regard to grief, there is always the assumption that delayed grief is more severe. But our studies showed that in fact it's less severe, and seems that these individuals enjoyed the benefits of years of employment, steady marriage, and lots of other things. So this helped them when they finally caved in, when they finally had a PTSD. Next slide, please. But nonetheless, despite the fact, the next slide, despite the fact that is very important, it's less severe. We also assessed the cognitive impairment of delayed onset and found that individuals, in this case, ex-prisoners of war with delayed PTSD had less difficulty in cognitive functioning years later than ex-POWs with chronic recovery and resilient trajectories. Next slide, please. But you can see that there's lots of effects because, and we also saw high rates of physical comorbidity, okay, and psychiatric comorbidity. Depression and anxiety were the most comorbid psychiatric disorders. And obviously, next slide, those who had combat stress reaction on the battlefield and then had PTSD were at greater risk for comorbidity. The next slide, please. Can we have, okay, when you have more comorbidity, the social functioning of individuals is obviously more impaired. If you suffer not only from depression, but not only from PTSD, but also PTSD and depression and anxiety, then your social functioning at work, in the family life, is obviously more impaired. Next one, please. And you can see it with the trajectories. With regard to physical health, PTSD is also associated with a lot of health issues, chronic diseases related to risk behaviors such as drugs, overeating, smoking, and whatnot, and also with premature psychological age. Next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about premature aging. Can we have the next slide, please? And we saw that it also is related to mortality. Individuals with CSR had higher rates of mortality. That is, they died earlier. So it's not only inconvenient and some daily functional impairment, but the psychiatric sequelae or consequences of war can also shorten your life. Next slide, please. You can see here the life chart of combat stress reactions. We also did a study, as I said, the next slide. We also did a study on the Yom Kippur War, and here I'll talk a little bit about ex-prisoners of war. Next slide. I don't know how many prisoners of war were taken by the Russians, but it's very important to pay very close attention to them because prisoners of war, at least in our case, suffer from various stresses such as solitary confinement, very harsh physical condition, torture, physical torture, horrible torture, oppression and humiliation, interrogation, and there are also issues of failure and betrayal because individuals who fall captive often blame themselves despite the fact that they had nothing to do. Next slide. What is also important about captivity, the next slide, is that the captors are at the total control of their captors. And this is important because we're talking about functioning soldiers, and all of a sudden they are rendered to be like childlike, and they depend on their captors for everything: food, drink, sleep, everything. And then we asked whether captivity ends at homecoming. Can we have the next slide, please? Again, this is similar to what we did in the other study. And we ask whether there are long-term effects. And you can see here again, the long-term effects in terms of PTSD rates. Next slide, please. And you can see that the red bars, that of the prisoners of war, are always higher than that of the controls. And you can see again that when we look at the various trajectories, ex-prisoners of war suffer or experience much longer, much more debilitating trajectories than the control combatants. Next slide, please. I've given you the numbers, but I'm not going to go into it. And obviously, with regard to complex PTSD, much like situation of domestic violence, we also have not only PTSD, but also complex PTSD, because this time it's not a single event. There is a deliberate, premeditated, man-made trauma that is the perpetrator has human face, but they behave like animals and they do horrible, horrible things, including deprivation and abuse and so on and so forth. Can we have the next slide, please? And again, this population also had very high psychiatric comorbidity. So we can see that it's not an isolated case of one study. And in fact, let me tell you that these are the longest follow-up studies in the world. No other army has actually looked at what happened to their soldiers for so many years after combat. And we see very high rates of comorbidity, again, of depression, anxiety, and OCD. Next slide, please. And again, we see here, next slide, that there is greater impairment when you have comorbidity, when you don't only suffer from PTSD, but also other problems, other psychiatric difficulties. And I often like to use this metaphor because trauma is pretty much like cancer. It's cancer of the soul, cancer of the psychic, because it metastasizes. It's not only reflected in PTSD, but also in other forms. Next slide, please. As we've seen, we have psychiatric comorbidity, we have problems, and here we see also somatic complaints. They become more easily ill, they expect their health to deteriorate, and they have now worse health. Next slide, please. And the issue of health, next slide, is actually manifested in numerous ways, and also there is, as you can by now appreciate, impaired functioning, unemployment, interpersonal difficulties at work, difficulties to maintain social ties, and also very severe family relations, both with their spouses and their children. Next slide, please. In this respect, next slide, it's very important to take into account the culture, the social cultural circumstances. If we'll have time, I'll go into it later. Also health risk behaviors, people resort to alcohol, to smoking, and to drugs. Again, it has a lot to do with the culture. Next slide. In the United States and in Great Britain, when people smoke and use a lot of alcohol, they have a lot more issues with alcohol and drugs. In Israel, we don't have alcoholism as a public health issue, and therefore we see relatively minor rates. But we see with time, when young people start to drink and use more drugs than my generation used, we see also health risk behaviors in individuals. So you have to watch out for whatever is common in your own culture and expect that you'll get different rates of health risk behavior. Next slide, please. A lot of the issues are colored and tainted and affected by the culture. The next slide, please. Particularly those that had to do with, the next slide, particularly those that have to do with habits and things that are culturally influenced. Here you can see that we have increased morbidity in terms of hypertension, diabetics, which is a major issue with relation to PTSD. Oftentimes you see diabetics in individuals with no family history of diabetic, which is quite unusual. Next slide, because we know, the next slide, please, because we know that stress can oftentimes lead to the onset of disorders, not only in those who have family vulnerability. Here we also looked at the national data of the Ministry of Health and compared same-sex and age as the XPOWs as control. And we see again increased morbidity. And again, this, let me stress it, most cases without a family history of a certain disease. Next slide, please. I assume that most of you are psychologists, but this has a lot of ramification beyond the sheer psychological outcome. Again, we found chronic pain to be more prevalent, and they had a different pain profile and a tendency to catastrophize, that is to see a lot of threats in the world. This was done via experiments in the laboratory. Next slide, please. We weren't sure if the men will be, next slide, please. We can see that the body actually keeps scores, and that is the body remembers the pain that was inflicted on it. This is a very important point as far as I'm concerned, because we see in trauma psychological premature aging. That is, people see a foreshortened future. They don't believe in what can happen to them. They expect their health to deteriorate. And also when we assess subjective age, they feel, they look, and they act as older than the chronological age. The next slide, please. I used to watch people as they came for testing, and oftentimes simply by looking at them, we could tell who was traumatized because they looked much, much older. And you can see the differences with regard to the way people feel about their appearance, how they feel, how they assess their subjective age, and they act as they're older than their age, and they have interests that are mostly of those of older people, and they feel less vital than individuals who are not traumatized. And I put this slide on because you can see the immense differences. Next slide, please. But aging, the next slide, the premature aging of individuals is not only psychological, it's also reflected in the body. And we looked at telomeres. Telomeres are parts of the DNA. It's like the chronological watch that the body has. And if you have shorter telomeres, then your life expectancy is much shorter. And we know that chronic stress and disability may shorten your telomeres. Next slide, please. So what we did in this study, we used telomeres And we took blood samples, and we compared the controls and the ex-POWs. As you could see, as a group, the ex-prisoners of war, that is the traumatized individuals, have a much shorter telomeres than the controls. The next one, please, the next slide. So this is indicative of the fact that they will have shorter life. And then we looked at the trajectories, and you can see that the delayed onset and the resilient have longer telomeres than the chronic and the recovered. Next one, please. So obviously, it is not just that the people feel, the next slide, it's not only that people feel that they're aging, but also the bodies actually show it. And we also saw that various biological markers of aging were related to greater suffering in captivity. The next slide, please. Again, when we looked at mortality, we saw that the traumatized ex-prisoners of war died prematurely. In fact, 35 years after the war, their mortality rate was 4 times higher than that of controls. And 42 years later, when all of them are aging, the mortality rate or the risk ratio was 1.66 higher than that of controls. Next slide. So trauma is not just about psychological suffering, but it's also about physiological aging. Now we looked at suicide ideation. And again, as you would expect, we found much higher suicidal ideation among the traumatized veterans, ex-POWs. If you look at the American data, they have a much higher suicide rate, completed suicide, than we have. We believe that a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Israeli society is very cohesive and the families are very tight. And so there is a lot of social support. Whereas in America, people are a lot more isolated and they're left to fend for themselves. Next slide, please. Now we looked at the trajectory of suicide, and you can see the same difference and how it's maintained over time. The next slide, please. I believe I'm almost done with my time. So now I'll talk a little bit about individuals who have been traumatized in the past. You have in the Ukraine, the older people experienced World War II. And obviously, the question of what impact earlier trauma has on coping with current trauma in old age is a very pertinent issue, both for you and for us. The next slide, please. There are several perspectives. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The vulnerability perspective, that if you experience trauma more than once, you are likely to succumb to stress. And obviously the crisis resolution perspective, that the way you came through the previous trauma is the one that will determine how you cope now. Can we have the next slide, please? We did many studies on the effects in various wars that we had, and now with the COVID, with coronavirus and so on. You have to take into account that when you're dealing with the elderly, and the horrific pictures that I've seen of the Ukraine with the old people, this has a lot of relevance to you, because aging entails many losses. You lose friends, you lose your partner, you retire, there is functional decline and so on. So aging itself is a very challenging period in one's life. Can we have the next slide, please? And obviously there are lots of psychological changes that are associated with aging. We pretty much preoccupied with our past. We think what we have done in our lives, this sort of life review. And the free time has the effect of triggering past memories and reactivation. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please?
Sorry, one moment.
Sorry. I'm nearing the end, so please, if it's possible, you have any problem with the slide? Or do you want me to end?
No, of course not. Yes, we have a little technical problems.
Okay, I can do it without the slides, don't worry. So we know that the aging is in itself a risk period, and there are lots of psychological changes that are associated with aging. As I said, preoccupation with the past and so on. And these all make old age a high risk period for individuals. Next slide, please. And particularly for the reactivation. The next slide, please. So once you have to take into account that as the veterans of the current war age, and also other people who have been through the war, there is a risk of reactivation, even if people respond now to stress of war without any visible signs. As they age, this might be changed. Can we have the next one? The question becomes why these veterans' distress is so entrenched. Why is it so deep-rooted? And the reason is that there is accumulation of stressors. War is an interpersonal trauma. There is somebody out there, human face, that wants to harm you. And obviously the physical hardship compound the mental anguish. Issues of failure, whether you're able to defend your country or not, betrayal of people whom you thought were your comrades or at least friends or allies, and the ongoing exposure to stress, at least in Israel, makes it very difficult to recover. But at the same time, you have to make sure that the social environment after war is pretty supportive. But at the same time, I assume there will be some economic hardships, ruined houses, and refugees who have to come home, a lot of challenges that you're facing. Can I have the very last slide? But in fact, the last slide, thank you. There are ripple effects of violence, because the violence does not only impact the primary victim. In our case, it's veterans, but also civilians. But what happens is that once you come home and you are traumatized, this affects your family life, your marital relationship, your parenting skills, and also the way that you can carry yourself in the workplace and socialize with people. So trauma, unfortunately, it's like a stone thrown into a water pool. It creates a lot of ripple effects that affect a lot of individuals who are not necessarily immediately affected. I hope that what I've shared with you, although quite traumatizing, will be of help to you in terms of conceiving of what is expected and what are the needs that you as mental health professionals are expected to fill both in the civilian and in the military population. So I wish you all the best. May God save you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. I've taken all my time, but
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Захава. That was amazing talk. Thank you very much. And I'm really impressed by your scientific data and your study of telomerase. And so this is really important for understanding the consequences of combat traumas. And here in the chat, there are a lot of thanks from our psychologists and psychiatric professionals. And so they are asking about whether there will be records of this. Так, є запитання про чи так, буде запис, він буде викладений на Ютубі з перекладом завтра на каналі Академії Добробут. І чи я запитаю наших співробітників, які керують Ютуб каналом, чи є там запитання на Ютубі?
На Ютубі запитань немає. Більшість людей слухали саме тут лекцію.
Угу. Ну, я зачитаю коментарі. Велике дякую, дуже важливе питання, порушені і висвітлені. І ще, так, вопрос писати. Вопрос треба писати десь тут у чаті. Якщо є питання, будь ласка, пишіть у чаті. Так, є ще коментарі. Надзвичайно якісна наукова лекція щодо наслідків бойової травми та наслідків тортур в полоні. Дякую. Це пише наш лікар Руслан Бояновський. Дякую, Руслане, за такий комент. Так, є питання. Що ми можемо зробити для того, щоб якось знизити кількість психічних захворювань серед постраждалих, як серед мирного, так і воєнного контингенту? Захава, could you please switch to English translation?
yes. Can you
You should choose in the bottom. You see the sign of Earth, and you should choose the English translation.
Can you help me again? Okay.
And you will hear the English translation.
I don't know. Does that work now?
Спробуйте мишкою знизу слайдів, знизу екрану знайти позначку земної кулі. Вона ж не слухає. Can you find the earth sign down the screen?
Interpretation. Is that the one?
Yes, this one.
Interpretation.
І так, choose the English and you will hear the translation.
I'm sorry, I can't find that. Okay, yeah, okay. I chose the English translation.
Так, зараз ви чуєте англійський переклад?
Yeah, thank you.
Тоді я повторюю запитання.
Thank you.
Що ми всі можемо зробити для того, щоб якось знизити кількість психічних захворювань серед постраждалих, як серед мирного, так і серед воєнного контингенту?
Well, there are obviously primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. The primary interventions are if you try and use as much as you can primary and secondary interventions, your chances are much greater to use less sophisticated treatment and get best results. When you resort to tertiary interventions, that is treatment of PTSD per se, then your chances of lowering mortality and morbidity are much slimmer. I have prepared for you another presentation on primary and secondary intervention, and I could send it to you. It's in English, but it has a lot of potential. For instance, we used some frontline intervention with the soldiers on the battlefield in 1982, using 3 very simple principles. The expectancy, you know, that people, when they're in shock, in the immediate state, they are very suggestible. So it's very easy to plant in their minds a lot of ideas. So if you can convince them at that point with very simple techniques of relaxation, and particularly mobilizing them to functioning, not letting them sink into it, then your chances are much greater. It's very difficult to give you the whole explanation in a very short answer, but as I said, I'm willing to send you the presentation, and a lot of it will be explicable by that. And in fact, we have data to show that when we did this intervention...
Дякуємо, Захава. Я думаю, що ми можемо також організувати переклад, тому, звичайно, зможемо продовжити цю співпрацю. Будемо дуже вдячні за додаткові матеріали. Наступне питання.
I'll do it. I'll send it to you because I believe that if you read it carefully and if need be go into the original articles, you will learn that this had an effect not only immediately, but also 20 years later, which is very impressive. Unfortunately, the interventions, when they're done on a tertiary level, that is, when people are already suffering from PTSD, the effects are relatively smaller. You can link it to concrete. When you use concrete for building, when you first form it, it's very, very soft. Even a child can form it. But once it dries out, it's very difficult. You need to use a lot of machinery, and oftentimes you break the concrete in your attempt to change it. So I'll be happy to share with you the materials. I'll send it to Nana.
Власне, в зв'язку з цим наступне питання є також уточнююче, з якого сроку після травми можна починати терапію?
As soon as possible. If you do it immediately, the consequences have better chances of being productive. Because people, as I said, are very labile and quite suggestible. It's very easy to help them in that period of time. They seem out of control, but it's also very good in terms of therapy. And the longer it takes for you to intervene, the more difficult it is to make a change in these people's lives. Now, I understand the difficulties, both of the therapists who are also engrossed in their own survival. It's not very easy to help someone else when you're still under the effects of trauma. But if you help other people, you help yourself. And the principle of helper therapy, when you help other people, there are great benefits for the therapist during that period of time.
Дякую дуже. Наступне питання. Чи є діагностичні критерії відтермінованого ПТСР?
Yeah. Obviously, it's the same. The PTSD is the same, has the same symptom as PTSD. But what you need to do is have a very good, take a good anamnesia of the individual and track back the symptoms to the event, which is easier said than done. It's very difficult. But if you can actually ascertain that a certain individual underwent a certain event, and oftentimes you see it in the flashbacks, in the memories, so a lot of things come back to that individual. And if you can tie in the traumatic event and the symptoms, this is how you diagnose it. The symptoms of delayed onset are no different than of classical PTSD.
Дякую. Наступне питання. Які техніки роботи з людьми похилого віку, виходячи з вашого досвіду, рекомендовано? Які техніки роботи з людьми похилого віку, виходячи з вашого досвіду, рекомендовано?
Senior citizens are no different, but if you ask gerontologists, that is individuals who work with older people on a regular basis, you have to give them some sort of training in trauma, and they're probably the best people to do it. Obviously, with older people, the more active they become. Don't let them kind of sink in. To engage them in social activities, even to help other people. It's always very helpful if you help someone else. And to feel that they're needed. I've seen in the media lots of older people in the Ukraine that have close ties with their children and grandchildren. So if they can help in those circumstances, it's great help.
Дякую. І останнє питання, яке в нас є в чаті на сьогодні, це заключне буде питання. Чи зараз проводяться які-небудь дослідження стосовно впливу ПТСР на ранню менопаузу?
I have not done anything on premature menopause, but it makes perfect sense to me that if there is an accelerated aging process that trauma brings about, menopause is obviously a sign of aging. And obviously, we know from other work that there are lots of issues with the hormonal system of women in terms of stress. For instance, young soldiers in Israel in basic training oftentimes lose their menstrual periods during training. So stress is closely linked to the hormonal system of the females as well. And I would assume that there will be an accelerated aging in women in that form. I did not study this population, but I suggest that you look for information in this regard. And maybe, this is something that could be done in the Ukraine, and we can learn from your experience. It's a very important topic to study, to research.
Шановна Захава, ми вам дуже вдячні за вашу лекцію. В чаті багато подяк від наших лікарів, від слухачів, психіатрів та психологів і сімейних лікарів, які тут були присутні. І ми навіть маємо таку пропозицію, що нашим лікарям було б цікаво також послухати ваш вебінар щодо профілактики ПТСР. І, мабуть, ми з вами обговоримо це питання. Якщо ви погодитесь, то ми організуємо наступний вебінар. Я також вибачаюсь за технічні проблеми, ми це обговоримо, і я вам обіцяю, що наступного разу ми не будемо мати таких технічних проблем. Я вам ще раз дуже дякую. Це дуже важливо для нас зараз, і ви, як ніхто інший, розумієте нашу ситуацію, і ситуацію з війною, і ситуацію, як наш народ тримає оборону на всіх фронтах. Ще раз дуже вам дякую. І до наступних зустрічей. До побачення.
Thank you. Goodbye. All the best to you. May God save you.
Дякую, до побачення.
Дякуємо, до побачення.
До побачення, дякуємо.
Дякую, до побачення. До побачення, дякуємо.
Бачення. Тода раба.
Дякуємо, до побачення.